call on the Honorable Premier to say prayers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning. Let us pray. Almighty God, from whom all wisdom and power are derived, we beseech thee so to direct and prosper the deliberations of the Legislative Assembly now assembled, that all things may be ordered upon the best and surest foundations for the glory of thy name, and for the safety, honor, and welfare of the people of these islands. Bless our Sovereign Lady, Queen Elizabeth II, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Charles, Prince of Wales, and all the royal family. Give grace to all who exercise authority in our Commonwealth, that peace and happiness, truth and justice, religion and piety may be established among us. Especially we pray for the Governor of our islands, the Premier, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, the Leader of the Opposition, Ministers of the Cabinet, ex officio members and members of the Legislative Assembly, that we may be enabled faithfully to perform the responsible duties of our high office. All this we ask for thy great name's sake. Let us say the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon us and give us peace now and always.
Please be seated.
Reading by the Honourable Speaker, messages and announcements.
None.
Presentation of petitions.
There are none.
Statements by honourable members and ministers of the Cabinet.
There are none, although I should say to the House, I'm expecting one later on.
Personal explanations.
None.
Obituary and other
There are
ceremony.
none.
Raising a matter of privileges.
None.
Government business, bills, the appropriation financial years 2018-2019 bill, 2017, continuation of debate on the budget address and the throne speech, together with the government's policy statement.
The appropriation financial years 2018-2019 bill, 2017, continuation of debate on the budget address and the throne speech, together with the government's policy statement. Any other member wish to speak? Honourable Member for Savannah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to make my contribution on the budget address, throne speech, and government's policy statement. Mr. Speaker, this is my 25th time at this, second only to you in this existing parliament. These have been some trying and interesting times, but Cayman is known for its survival. Mr. Speaker, I would like to take this opportunity to say how I was so impressed by the 4 freshmen that have spoken. Member from Georgetown South, Prospect, Boddentown West, Central, and also our sophomore minister, my colleague from Boddentown East. It's good to see new blood, people with new ideas. I understand it's 5. I said Georgetown. So West. Oh,
West and South. Georgetown West and South.
I apologize. Mr. Speaker, the knowledge that some of these bring, and I refer to my colleague from Bordentown West, in the area of accounting and finance, the perspective that he brought without any negative criticism, but pointing, Mr. Speaker, to some ideas that I think will benefit these islands. I was also impressed with the new lady member, how she spoke with passion on education. And of course, the member from Prospect, who we're all familiar with on the radio station, he still has that knack to get the word over with emphasis. And of course, my good friend from Georgetown West. Solid, it reminds me of how I started and still am, on the quiet side. But politics, Mr. Speaker, is all about the people. Staying in touch with them. And anytime any of you youngsters fail to remember that, just take a walk on that, I call it southeast wall, where the pictures are of all legislators, and you will see, I think the last time I counted was either 14 or 15 one-term representatives. So it behooves us to stay in touch with our people, do what's right. The Minister of Health is bringing a new approach to health. And I want to thank you, sir, before I get any further, for acquiring that other piece of land for Coalwood Beach. It's a great addition. Speaker, my first emphasis, and as just about all of us from this side of the opposition, has been in regards to education. I joined my colleagues as we visited most of the public, or all of the public schools. I was unable to attend to two. But Mr. Speaker, it was a revelation as we met with the administration, and it was most enjoyable as we met with the kids. Probably one of the most touching of our visits was to East End, Mr. Speaker. When a young child there, I think it was year 5, when she was asked what she'd like to do, and she blew us all away with her knowledge, comprehension, and understanding of mental health. That's where she wanted to focus her efforts as she grows up. Very touching. We made 2 or 3 visits to Clifton Hunter. Mr. Speaker, there's much help that needs to go there. Things that have been pointed out to us that needs to be changed. Beautiful facility, but some of it, they've indicated some of the areas are not fit for purpose. And I specifically remember when we stayed over for a quick lunch, we went to where they were sharing out the food. Mr. Speaker, there were hundreds, I think it's between 200 and 300 kids in a little area. Probably the serving is just a little bit bigger than that, where they pass the food over. I'm asking that in due course that this be looked at and try to provide I don't know how you would open it up, but make a bigger area so that the flow would be more smooth than what's happening. Mr. Speaker, the other area that most of the administration was telling us was the lack of textbooks. And I guess, Mr. Speaker, I'm old-fashioned, but it's hard for me to understand to how the continuity of children learning having to take stuff home from school to study. And one of the big shortages in some of the schools was paper that need to be used for photocopying. I would implore the powers that be that we look at providing proper textbooks. I think it would go a long way, Mr. Speaker, in helping those children to retain and study, and the parents would have a better grasp of what's happening in the subject and read to them from their books. We looked at John Gray, and I'm asking that as soon as possible that this facility be finished. I understand some of the existing buildings that are used are infested with these different things that cause breathing problems. Mr. Speaker, we're talking about human beings and children. There's so much talent in these schools, Mr. Speaker, and how they express themselves, that they just want to do good by living in the right atmosphere. I want to say a big thank you to the new minister, Mr. Speaker, continuing the efforts of the last education minister. And something that we have on this side have been saying for the teachers, let us try and reward them for the efforts that they're putting with our children. Mr. Speaker, our children spend majority of their days with them. I have a daughter-in-law who's a teacher, and I know the hours that she spends in preparation for her classes. Hours that at times she have to not necessarily neglect her own children, my grandchildren, but the time that it takes to help run the school. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of the Savannah Primary School, and I may seem partial to that, but as you know, Mr. Speaker, I'm an alma mater of Savannah School, attending that some many, many years ago. And it brings me to the concern that in this Savannah, Newlands area, and the entire Bordentown district, the need for another primary school. I understand, Mr. Speaker, that Savannah is approaching capacity. The ideal set out in the guidelines or perceptions that no primary school should go over 500. I think Savannah is close to 480, maybe a little bit over. These are a lot of strain, Mr. Speaker, on the budget. But what if we don't deal with these children? Mr. Speaker, one of the things that we found out in these schools, especially the primary schools, is the need for more specialized care for some of our children, care for mental health. I remember in the last government, when it was shared with us by one of the schools that about 25% of the children were in need of more committed care that would guide them before they get too far in their mental capacity, to identify them earlier, and don't wait till, I think it was stage 3 of the assessments that they do. We cannot afford, Mr. Speaker, to allow these children to advance at that level, graduate from year 6, go on to Clifton Hatter. Sadly, some of them can't even read. I'm made to understand, Mr. Speaker. We can do better. We must do better. It's the future of these islands. And I need not tell you what happens when the children don't get a proper education. As some of my other colleagues have said, what we spend on Northward Prison over $70,000 on an inmate. Let us look at using some of this money for education for our children. What a great investment. What a great investment that would be when instead of them going to Northward, they will be going to universities and getting the degree, their exposure from other successful countries. Mr. Speaker, the last thing I want to talk about on education is specifically to those schools close to the public road. I've said to the police in our meetings at Savannah between the elected member from Newlands that I expect something to be done and done quickly. I will hold responsible someone when they hit one of those children. And up until this morning, Mr. Speaker, the vehicles, those big trucks, are flying across those primary schools. No one pays them any mind. No one. I've shared this with the district leader for the police station in Bordentown, and I also shared it with the commissioner. I cannot understand those of us that travel to the great United States, when you pass a school zone and see 15 miles an hour, you literally reverend that sign. And I make bloody sure that I'm even under that. Why can't we do the same thing in Cayman? Why can we not put some of these supposedly cameras, and we only need 4 or 5 in the areas around those schools that are closest to the public road? I would venture to say, Mr. Speaker, we could almost pay for a third of the portion of the budget for the police, because as I'm made to understand by a friend of mine who got caught, it's 4 or 5 times the amount you have to pay if you're caught speeding in a school zone. Come on. Let us work together. Public Works, police, and education to expedite getting this put in place. It pains me as I continually see people overtaken in these areas. Which leads me on to the police. Mr. Speaker, I must say that Commissioner Byrne has brought some stability to the force. Things have stabilized somewhat, but I implore him to once again set up a traffic department within the police force. Because, Mr. Speaker, nobody pays any attention to the speed limit anymore. No way. I see going down on Spot Street, as I've said so many times before, Mr. Speaker, doing 40 miles an hour, and they pass me like I'm standing still. Some of the cars, no tail lights, no brake light. No license plate. And don't talk about, Mr. Speaker, might as well repeal the thing about talking on cell phones. Once again, Mr. Speaker, you know what? As bad as we need money for education. Oh, you better. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, through the peace, we need to get our act together in these areas of the traffic. Because when you see how some of the people drive, oh my goodness. Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to, before I leave education, which I did momentarily, but there was an article in the paper, and with your permission, Mr. Speaker, it was on the July the 19th, in education, let's return to the tried and true. If you allow me just to read this briefly. The recent story of 17 students passing a math exam out of 139, retaking it points out the sorry state of education in Cayman's public schools. We have spent millions of dollars on new physical facilities, which turn out to seem unacceptable results. Einstein said that the definition of insanity is doing the same things over and over and expecting a different result. Want a different result? Go back to the tried and true old ways. Ever since education bought into the emperor's new clothes, I don't know which emperor that was, Mr. Speaker. In other words, into the new math, okay, but there is no need for teaching. Just as an aside there, Mr. Speaker, last year, sometime a year before, I tried to help one of my grandchildren with new math. The parents told me, don't you do that again. They got all their sums wrong. So, Mr. Speaker, that's just as an aside. But what's happening doing normal addition and subtraction and division and multiplication, the old-time way that, look at all of us in here. You youngsters, some of you might have used the new math. Look at the premier where he is today. He didn't have new math. Look at the deputy governor. And even the attorney general back in Jamaica. Did you have new math? Mr. Speaker, did you have new math when you were at West Bay Primary? No. English grammar nor sentence construction and into the fantasy that every child is intellectually curious. Many high school graduates cannot read, write, or do basic math, let alone know very much about the wide world around them. This is the product being foisted on unsuspecting but increasingly aware employers. The new math has befuddled many parents. See, it wasn't by myself. And continues to do so, let alone the poor students attempting to master it. The results are clearly not only disastrous for pupils, but also our whole country. Why is it that a 1950s or early 1960s high school diploma is the equivalent of a university degree today? And I'm being generous. Why is it that using Canada as an example, today's students cannot pass a test which students of all ages in a one-room schoolhouse in rural Saskatchewan passed in 1913? 1913. Sounds a bit antiquated. This is a phenomenon which occurs all over the world. The economist Thomas Sowell has called it the vision of the anointed. In other words, the elite educational bureaucracy bought into methods of teaching which do not benefit the majority of students who need a foundation of basic skills and knowledge on which to build their real-life experience. Mr. Speaker, an attempt to challenge the vision of the anointed and to say that the emperor has no clothes is met with ridicule by the educational establishment. As in, you must be stupid to challenge the vision of all those government bureaucrats and expensive consultants. I do not blame the teachers who are caught up along with students and their parents in this grand charade. However, it is time to stop the charade and tell the truth. Why were methods of teaching and doing math, which had been successful for centuries, thrown over for the new math, the new utopia? I would venture a guess that Linton Tibbetts, when growing up on the bracket, I should say, Mr. Linton Tibbetts, although it doesn't have there, was not taught the new math. I would also venture that along with the old math, he was taught English, grammar, geography, physics, and civics. Therefore, do you want to change the results? And the gentleman gives an answer. Go back to the old ways. They are tried and true. I recognize that the apologists for the anointed will have more excuses for not doing so than Carter has liver pills. I haven't heard that phrase in a long time. I have plenty of them, Mr. Speaker, as you probably know from our parents. However, the time for excuses is over. The time for accountability has arrived and must be demanded. This is another little short one, Mr. Speaker, which was found in the printed in the London Times. It was an obituary. Found this quite interesting. Today we mourn the passing of a beloved old friend, Common Sense, who has been with us for many years. No one knows for sure how old he was, since his birth records were long ago lost in bureaucratic red tape. He will be remembered as having cultivated such valuable lessons as knowing when to come in out of the rain, why the early bird gets the worm. Life isn't always fair, and I'm sure all of us legislators know that. And maybe it was my fault. Common Sense lived by simple, sound financial policies. Don't spend more than you can earn, and reliable strategies. Adults, not children, are in charge. His health began to deteriorate rapidly when well-intentioned but overbearing regulations were set in place. Reports of a 6-year-old boy charged with sexual harassment for kissing a classmate. Teens suspended from school for using mouthwash after lunch. And a teacher fired for reprimanding an unruly student only worsened his condition. Common Sense lost ground when parents attacked teachers for doing the job that they themselves had failed to do and discipline their unruly children. It declined even further when schools were required to get parental consent to administer sun lotion or an aspirin to a student, but could not inform parents when a student became pregnant and wanted to have an abortion. Common Sense lost the will to live as the churches became businesses. Wow. And criminals received better treatment than their victims. Sounds familiar? Especially in the great United States. Common Sense took a beating when you couldn't defend yourself from a burglar in your own home, and the burglar could sue you for assault. Trust me, Mr. Speaker, that one better don't think about coming over 65 Lottery Road. You're not going to be able to sue me. Common Sense finally gave up the will to live after a woman failed to realize that a steaming cup of coffee was hot. That happened on a trip on a plane and McDonald's and a plane from here going to Jamaica. She spilled a little in her lap and was promptly awarded a huge settlement. Common Sense was preceded in death by his parents, truth and trust, by his wife, discretion, by his daughter, responsibility, and by his son, reason. He is survived by his 5 stepbrothers. I know my rights. I want it now. Someone else is to blame. I am a victim. Pay me for doing nothing. Have we heard that so many times? Sadly, not many attended his funeral because so few realized he was gone. If you still remember this, pass this on, colleagues. If not, join the majority and do nothing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to read these pertinent things and what seems to be happening around us with our education and so on. Mr. Speaker, I continue on government land sales, and I was a part of the caucus when this was brought up. And I can understand selling little slivers of land, Mr. Speaker, but I do have concern on the big acreage. And just to share with you, when we were asked, thank you very much. I'm very, very pleased to hear that, Mr. Premier. And I wrote back to Mr. Fawcett, I object to the disposal of government land in Bordentown, especially on the beach side. Please go back and check the original maps, as from what I remember, some of these properties were larger than what is now shown on your maps. Please do not sell or dispose of government land in Bordentown. I think this is a sentiment shared, Mr. Speaker, by most of us sitting in here, no matter how small that land is. It can be used for something, play areas for children and the communities. Mr. Speaker, I now move on to roads. You know my feeling on this. I preached it can't say from time Jesus was on Rivera Beach, but when I came into the parliament, we cannot build ourselves out of traffic. Trust me. And I'm so pleased to see that our present minister has seen the light on that. And the compass on the 18th of July, he noted the new minister cautioned, we can only build so many roads. At some point, we are going to run out of space. He said government will need to look at improving public transportation and potentially promoting ride sharing if the population and traffic congestion continue to grow. Well said, Mr. Minister. And you can go back from when I was first dumped into a cabinet back in 2004, not even asked which ministry I wanted. I started telling them this. Take 10, 15, $20 million and buy a bunch of buses, and if necessary, give it to the people. And I am sure, Mr. Speaker, that if you had a dependable bus service every 5, 10 minutes running, we wouldn't have all of the mess that we have midnight or later that we now have out there. Please forgive me on Linford Pearson. The expansion of that. Mary Magdalene. It's a good thing we didn't have to build a lot more roads like that. I understand it was done for, what do I think of Georgetown is there? Oh, the revitalizing of Georgetown. Whatever that fancy word is. Mr. Speaker, as I drive that road every morning, there are one lane now, 2 lanes in some areas. But I note, and I guess at some time there will be a difference when we open up those 2 lanes and dump them on our other 1 lane. There's no way in Georgetown to park. You're speeding up, coming down from these to get in that beautiful paved full of roundabouts highway. Where are you going to park? Mr. Speaker, I know we've had inclement weather, but the time that is spent on that, I see them rip it, they grade it, they roll it, they wet it, they rip it, they grade it, they roll it, they wet it, over and over. I guess somebody knows what they're doing. Mr. Speaker, I just hope and pray that it functions and it will help alleviate the traffic. I know my colleague from East End built the Newlands bypass, dramatic help. But once again, Mr. Speaker, it plugged right up. God, we didn't open that then and keep going for whatever reason. But Mr. Speaker, before we go, this is going east in the evenings, and I'll preach this nearly as long as the other one. Any of us coming from Georgetown in the evening from 4 o'clock on, I've said it, Honorable Minister for Works. Many of your predecessors have said it to the Commissioner. Please, I beg you, give me a little try on this one. From 4 till 6 or 4 till 7 in the evening, block off the traffic coming out of South Sound Road going east. Ask any of my colleagues going east what happens. One little lane coming out there and they got to get the right way. Blocking 2 lanes of traffic coming out of Georgetown. It don't make sense. Please try it. If it don't work, then you can blame it on me. By then I'll be going with Kurt catch fish. Mr. Speaker, I miss him here, I must say, my colleague. 2 of us came in here together. Pragmatic gentleman. Of course, our friends over at the Compass even agreed with me on this one. Same thing, Cayman cannot pave its way out of traffic jams. We didn't need him to tell us that. We had need leave in Miami when he was the last time when he beat up on our premier. But life goes on. Life goes on, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was pleased that the minister visited with the member from New Orleans and I, looking at their roads up in the 2 districts. And I'm hoping with great anticipation we'll get some work done there. A bunch of drain wells. I know, and I overheard some of my Georgetown colleagues saying how well they had done in getting wells in certain areas. And I know you will do no less for us up that way. North Sound Gardens, the entrance going in there. The problem is, as I shared with you, Mr. Speaker, to the Honorable Minister, that so much of the land down in there is saturated in hundreds, probably thousands of acres are underwater. So when the rainy season comes, digging deep wells, it's like spitting in the ocean. There's another word I would use, but not. You might stop me. And the water is, that's right. So I'm asking that you take a look at these. The other area, and I briefly shared with you, is about Pedro Castle, that piece of road going up there. I constantly get calls on that. I don't think it's gazetted. Many, many years ago, a piece of road was gazetted there, 50 feet wide, down in the middle of the Borden's Quarry. It would take care a bit of fill from East End to bring that up to level, so that needs to be looked at and reassessed. A proper gazettal of that piece of road there. If not, throw a few shovelfuls of dirt in that piece of road to the east of what we call the Eden Cemetery and Pedro Castle. Not a lot of people live up there, but I would be grateful for anything that can be done there. Some speed bumps, which we've shared with you in different areas up there. Look forward to that, Honorable Minister. Mr. Speaker, as I look at the roads, I see as we continue to build more new roads. And for those of us that live in Bordentown, East End, and North Side, the deterioration of those roads. Mr. Speaker, my colleague, friend of Works, you better know you got some reserves coming up, because despite the cracks that I'm seeing in them, and that was not designed for them gigantic 100-foot trailers and tractors that I see going over that, Mr. Speaker. Please take a look at that and see what can be done. Because we are, if these, especially with the rain and weather keeping up, we are in for a long, long summer and winter next year with those roads. Potholes are getting in there, and I must say that your people do a prompt job in filling as soon as they seem to appear. But that is just like putting Band-Aid on a big cut. Mr. Speaker, immigration. I'm glad to hear that the Premier is going to be looking at that in a holistic manner. Some of the stories I hear coming out there, I pray that something soon be done. Which leads me on, Mr. Speaker, that I'm not sure, I'm told that we so emotionally debated in the last sitting of the House, talked about in so many times, the Legal Practitioners Bill. And I must thank my colleague from East End and now departed colleague, Mr. Winston Connolly, how he brought that to light, that what it appeared, if it went through, would mean to our young Caymanians. Mr. Speaker, I hope it soon come back in a proper light that will benefit our young Cayman lawyers and others. We've seen what the accounting firms have done with Caymanians, where we have many of them, and the next one sitting as our finance minister. And I would encourage him to tell his colleagues, let's get this together for the lawyers, our Cayman lawyers. People come here and make millions, probably billions of dollars off of these areas of finance. And our young Caymanians struggle and wait for the crumbs to fall off the table. That must stop, Mr. Speaker, and I encourage this government in their next 3+ years to look at that and put the right legislation in place that will be good for our people. Mr. Speaker, the next area is social services. Mr. Speaker, I remember that when you and I in our early days, with you being there before, when it comes to the elder, the seamen, and the veterans, I think it was $50 a month when you were there, when you started. 25.
When I started.
And you took some merciless licks because you moved it up to 50, 75, 100 and kept incrementally. So when we left, it was up to 550. These are people who have sacrificed their lives at times. Some did. And I hope that their surviving spouse will benefit from it. Mr. Speaker, it is important that we remember the people that built these islands from where we were back in those days. If it wasn't for those seamen, where would we been today? It was interesting when some of my colleagues pointed out that some of the benefits that we plan to give, it didn't seem to have the funding for it. But I'm sure the minister, whoever is responsible for these areas, will find a way to help. Because, Mr. Speaker, there are plenty of people in need. They're hurting. I'm sure I'm not the only one that some of these come to daily, weekly, monthly, just to get something, Mr. Speaker, for the children. Buy lunch money. Get lunch money for the children. Some of them, the only breakfast they get is when they go to the schools. It's incomprehensible in a place like Cayman, reportedly the 5th or 6th largest finance center in the world, with the billions of dollars that flow through here to these big companies, that they just won't take little pity on our people that are in need. People losing their houses. Mr. Speaker, just yesterday someone sent me a WhatsApp or something. Nice looking house. And I don't know what the background was. But the person indicated that they were behind $3,600 and something dollars. Can you imagine the money that they had put in that, and they were losing their house? 3,000. I don't know how many months that was. We cannot sit down and let these people do this. And I must say that my colleague from Bordentown West has talked about this with us. The legislation in the UK, for whatever reason, can we not get something here that will help preserve? How can a person put hundreds of thousands of dollars of assets into their home, and because they get behind in these hard times, and we all know what happened after 2009, Mr. Speaker, the bottom drop out of the whole bucket. But thank God we were blessed in many ways. But there were a number of us that has found it very hard, very difficult. We must somehow or the other find out a way to preserve them, even if it's legislation. Give these people a chance. They have children. They're hurting. They're hurting, Mr. Speaker. And what's going to happen to them? We're going to drive them to sell drugs? Are we going to just leave them out there and languish? And when they get old enough, help them with the little pittance from social services? No, Mr. Speaker. As I look across the aisle in front of me, I know all of my colleagues have that feeling. Let us do something now about helping those people that are really in need. Some of them go to bed hungry. It's not going to be good news for us down the line if we don't take care of our own people. Mr. Speaker, let's have a heart. Last thing I want to talk about, Mr. Speaker, in that general area is planning. Mr. Speaker, the bureaucracy that seems to be involved, and I know that after Hurricane Ivan, and I support that, there were certain regulations and changes in the planning law that our houses don't collapse on us and so on and so forth. Mr. Speaker, some of the stories I've heard from people, I know there was an individual building something, but not as big as your room. And the inspections and the checking and they even went as far to say if this had been me when I saw the application, I wouldn't have approved it. How in the world can we have civil servants telling our people these kind of things? Let's be realistic, Mr. Speaker. Not all of us can afford those $100,000 homes. A home is a home. You see, Mr. Speaker, I grew up in a little wattle and daub home up in Alowala Bush, behind to the west of where Paul Borden is. And I had a little track of road there. But it was a home. We were happy. And I must say that my parents did a pretty good job in raising me. Bless their memory. As all of us Caymanians here as representatives. People wonder why we are such a successful nation. But we are getting away from what brought us to where we are. And changing that course, as I read to you earlier on, with common sense. It doesn't take a lot to get back to those days. Efforts that doesn't cost hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars. Let's invite, Mr. Speaker, common sense back in. We can make a difference. We have the nucleus, we have the platform, the basic structures in place to make these islands, as many of us try to do. And I know the Minister of Tourism, I must take your hat off what you've been able to do with tourists that stay over and the cruise ship passengers. And I know that your feelings, and we look forward to seeing your presentation before I make a final decision, whether we could take all that money and put it to your colleague from Cayman Brac on your right in education, or some of it. Justin. Mr. Speaker, these islands are too precious for us to make them get away from us from petty nonsense. We've come too far. Mr. Speaker, the last thing I want to talk about, and I briefly mentioned to you, it's in regards to our culture. When some of these visitors come here and want to tell us what to do, to change our laws, to change our constitution, but Mr. Speaker, as long as I'm here, it ain't gonna happen. I told many of them it was because of the Christian community that I'm back here, as I had no intentions of running for the 7th time. They begged, they pleaded, and I'm back. But my nemesis just doesn't seem to want to go away. I see he sent a press release speaking of none other than Mr. Just had to sign Leonardo. Leonardo Raznovich. And what I did, Mr. Speaker, take exception to, and all of us are familiar with the release. He says the government should stop seeking to contort the law and read it in a manner that is incorrect but perceived to be consistent with the norms of the predominant Christian faith and way of thinking. Faith is incredibly important to many and must be respected too. But the Cayman Islands is not a theocracy. We didn't say we were. But we are bound and built on a good Christian heritage. Look at the success that we've been over the last 40, 50 years, the leadership we have. Hence, faith must not trump the actual laws of these islands in existence today, irrespective of the majority position. So we must do what the minority say. But thank goodness, Mr. Speaker, there was another ruling way back that I brought to the attention of this House when he first started this, that took a lot of air out of his balloon. This latest one, Mr. Speaker, will make it collapse. And it says, the headline, European Court, gay marriage is not a human right. The highest human rights court in Europe, the highest, Mr. Speaker, this is not a little one he's talking about, and I think that Italy and they befuddled in, I don't know. Shattered hopes that it would judicially impose same-sex marriage when it told a male to female transsexual and his wife that a civil union should be good enough for them. European human rights law does not require countries to grant access to marriage to same-sex couples, according to a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights in a case that tests the remote boundaries of possibility in law and fact. Mr. Speaker, continuing, the parties to the litigation and supporters of same-sex marriage acknowledge the result was predictable. Nevertheless, the judgment has a devastating effect on gay rights in Europe, dashing hopes that same-sex marriage can become a reality. The facts of the case are distinctive. Heli Hamilanian of Finland had a sex change operation in 2009 to appear anatomically as a woman. Stick a pin there, Mr. Speaker. Any medical person will tell you, you born a man, you're born a woman, and no matter how much surgery you do, you're not going to change them. Despite having fathered a child with his wife of over 10 years in 2002. Before the operation, he tried to change his legal identity from male to female without success. That's an interesting one. He sued before the European Court when he was told that it would not be possible so long as he remained married, because Finland does not allow persons of the same sex to marry each other. Hamalayan and his spouse insist that their religious beliefs prevent them from seeking a divorce, and that civil unions do not give them the same benefits as marriage in Finnish law. The European Court was unequivocal. It not only said that European human rights law does not contemplate same-sex marriage, it said that civil unions are good enough for same-sex couples. The court confirmed that the protection of the traditional institution of marriage is a valid state interest, implicitly endorsing the view that relations between persons of the same sex are not identical to marriage between a man and a woman, and may be treated differently in law. I could have told them that from a long time ago. But this is now coming from the highest court in Europe. The judgment says that European human rights law recognizes the fundamental right of a man and a woman to marry and to found a family. To found a family. It could be pretty hard for some of them that talk about getting married to each other of the same sex, that they could bring forth and procreate. And enshrines the traditional concept of marriage as being between a man and a woman. This is done by the European Court. I don't know why we make it turn out. When my premier tells them that they can take us to these human rights courts. This whole. It explains how no European, and this surprised me, Mr. Speaker, it explains how no European consensus on same-sex marriage exists, as only 10 of the 47 countries bound by the treaty allow such designations. Now, somebody has been filling our head with nonsense all over the place, that this was all a cut and dry deal. No, not today, Bobo, as you would say, sir. The ruling is a particular hard blow to gay rights in Finland, where a parliamentary committee rejected same-sex marriage before it could be brought to a vote last month for the second time since 2012. Finland is the only Scandinavian country that does not allow same-sex marriage. And I look forward to one of these days, Mr. Speaker, when I can attempt, and I would like to have seen it in the last election, to be affirm and know what the public says and what they would like to see in regards to this. It's in our marriage law of 2010, in our Constitution, Section 614. Around the world, gay activists have been told that same-sex marriage is not a human right. Not me saying that. I know that my friends in the press and the paper, they're going to have a field day. Just refer them back to this ruling from the highest court in Europe, human rights. Mr. Speaker, I will now close with my last little reading, which I may have done before. It's just a little page. And when I look around and see what's happening in Cayman and the world, God have mercy on us. United States used to be a paradigm, almost a beautiful place to be. Now it's become one of the most wicked nations on earth. Anything goes. Courts hold it up, most of them. Thank goodness we finally got a justice on there, Gorsuch, that will try to straighten some of this out, and we'll get a couple more in the next few years. This comes from Billy Graham's daughter when she was interviewed on the early show. She was asked, how could God let something like this happen? She was referring to the attacks on September 11, 9/11. And Graham gave an extremely profound and insightful response. She said, I believe God is deeply saddened by this, just as we are. But for years, we've been telling God to get out of our schools, to get out of our government, and to get out of our lives. And being the gentleman he is, I believe he has calmly backed out. How can we expect God to give us his blessings and his protection if we demand he leave us alone? In light of recent events, terrorist attacks, school shootings, I think it started when Madeleine Murray O'Hare, and I'm sure most of us are familiar with that lady, she brought in that there's no God. She was murdered, her body found recently. Complained she didn't want prayer in our schools. And we said, okay. Then someone said, you better not read the Bible in school. The Bible says, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and love your neighbor as yourself. And we said, okay. Then Dr. Benjamin Spock said, we shouldn't spank our children when they misbehave because their little personalities would be warped and we might damage their self-esteem. Incidentally, Mr. Speaker, Dr. Spock's son committed suicide. We said an expert should know what he's talking about. And we said, okay. Now we're asking ourselves why our children have no conscience, why they don't know right from wrong, and why it doesn't bother them to kill strangers. We just see yesterday what happened in the church. God have mercy on the great United States, a nation that was built on the Word of God, a nation that put on their money, in God we trust. And sadly, right now, that's the last thing they do. Their classmates and themselves, this is killing them. Probably if you think about it long and hard enough, we can figure it out. I think it has a great deal to do with reap what we sow. Funny how simple it is for people to trash God and then wonder why the world's going to hell. Funny how we believe what the newspapers say and fake news. I added that latter one. But question what the Bible says. Funny how you can send jokes through email and they spread like wildfire. But when you start sending messages regarding the Lord, people think twice about sharing. Funny how lewd, crude, vulgar, and obscene articles pass freely through cyberspace, but public discussion of God is suppressed in the school and workplace. Are you laughing? Funny how when you share this message, you will not send it to many on your address list because you're not sure what they believe or what they will think of you for sending it. Funny how we can be more worried about what other people think of us than what God thinks of us. Pass it on if you think it has merit. If not, then just discard it. No one will know you did. But if you discard this thought process, don't sit back and complain about what bad shape the world is in. God bless you as we share with friends. No nation or people can ever survive or succeed without Jesus Christ. I hope in these hallowed halls we will remember this, Mr. Speaker, as at times we seem to be on a slippery slope. As leaders, we can make a difference by example. Do that which is right for our people, and He will continue to bless these islands. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We will take a 15-minute break.